My name is Micah Wood, and I grew up a pastor's son for the majority of my life, just going after God, experiencing His presence and His love and His touch in my life. But by the time I was 15 years old, I had developed just an outrageous addiction to pornography. And it so affected every area of my life that I got to the point where I would cut pictures out of magazines and put them in my pocket and carry them to school when I was hanging out with friends. And I thought about it at school, I thought about it at church, I thought about it at home, and my addiction just went to another level when we got internet in my home. On the weekends when my parents would go and visit my grandparents, I would lie so I could stay home. I'd say I was sick, but then spend hours upon hours looking at pornography on the computer, and then go in my room and lay on my bed and just cry and ask God for forgiveness. But it was so bad, and I knew I could not stop doing it, that I got to the point where I stopped asking for forgiveness altogether. And I was very suicidal. I began to idolize people like Kurt Cobain and bands with lead singers that had committed suicide and that sang about death and wrote poetry about death. And I began to get their biographies, I began to get their posters and put them up all over my room and just surround myself with this fascination of death and suicide. My mom obviously knew something was wrong with me. And she was praying one day, and God spoke to her heart and said, something has to be done for your kids. Particularly Micah is dying. So she heard about what God was doing here in Hamilton, Alabama at the ramp, and so she loaded us up in the church van with the youth group, and she took me against my will. When we went, it was packed, it was hot, it was crowded, and worship went on forever, and all I could think about was how much I hated it and how much I wanted to leave. But at the same time, while worship was going on, I didn't like it, but I felt that same love of God that I'd known as a child, and that same touch, and that same conviction of God that was saying, what you're doing is wrong. But there's a love here and there's a power here that's great enough to set you free. So there came an opportunity to respond to the altar call. And I was so pulled. I knew what God was saying to my heart was to come and to be set free. But I was so afraid of what my mom was going to think of me. I didn't want her to know what I was dealing with. But I finally found myself just working up the courage to shove into the aisle. I found myself running down to the altar. And at the time I was wearing a blue Florida Gators cap. When I got to the altar, I took it off and just threw it on the ground and lifted up my hands. And when I did, tears just started running down my face as the love and the power of Jesus just broke through and broke off of my life the weight of sin and suicide and depression. I felt in a moment the addiction to pornography break, and I just sat there and wept and wept and wept as the love of God was just so real in my heart. And I don't remember, honestly, anything else about the service that night. That night began something in me. It initiated a journey in me, to where now it's been over 7.5 years since I've looked at one pornographic image. It's been just as long since there's been anything connected with death or suicide or depression, all the junk connected with pornography, and that whole life driven by lust and perversion has been absolutely broken off of my life, because that night I experienced the love and the power of Jesus.